That guitar looks like it survived a war, John. Carson's voice carried clean across the studio, warm with the easy confidence of a man who owned every room he walked into. He leaned back in his chair, one hand gesturing toward the battered prop guitar sitting in the corner of the set. A cheap factory-made thing with a warped neck and tuning pegs that hadn't held pitch properly in 2 years. Let's find out if it still works. He slid it across the desk with a grin. The studio audience laughed right on cue. Johnny Cash didn't laugh. He looked at the guitar the way a man looks at something that has just said his name in a room full of strangers. Not anger, not offense. Something quieter than both of those things, and far more dangerous. The studio lights were hot on the desk between them. 40 million people were watching through their television sets across America. Carson still had the grin on his face, the grin of a man who believed he had just made excellent television. Cash reached out, his hand closed around the neck of that cheap guitar, and the second his fingers touched the strings, the laughter in Studio One died. Not gradually, not politely. It just stopped, the way sound stops when something shifts in a room that everyone can feel but nobody can name. A woman in the fourth row pressed her lips together. The bandleader's hands went still over his piano keys. One of the cameras, instead of pulling to a wide shot the way the director had planned, held on Cash's face. For a moment, no one moved, but that moment didn't start there. It started 20 years earlier, in a cotton field in Arkansas, with a boy and a broken instrument and a promise he hadn't found the words for yet. Dyess, Arkansas, 1942. The land was flat, and the work was hard, and the Cash family picked cotton from sunup until the light gave out. There was no money for instruments. There was barely money for anything else. But Johnny Cash was 12 years old, and there was music inside him that had nowhere to go, so he built it a door out of whatever he could find. A neighbor's old guitar with 2 strings missing, a church pew hymnal with the cover torn off, a voice that came out of him bigger than a boy his size had any right to produce. He didn't learn music, he absorbed it, out of the radio his mother kept on the kitchen counter, out of the gospel songs the congregation sang on Sunday mornings, out of the silence of the fields where the only sound was wind moving through rows of cotton and a boy humming something he hadn't written yet. He never forgot what it felt like to play a broken instrument. He never forgot that the music didn't care whether the strings were right or the neck was warped or the tuning was off by half a step. The music came through anyway. That was the first thing Arkansas taught him, and it was the thing he carried every single time he stepped onto a stage for the rest of his life. I Walk the Line was not written in a studio. It was not produced or polished or arranged. In 1956, Cash was stationed with the Air Force in Landsberg, Germany, and he recorded the melody into a reel-to-reel tape player in the middle of the night, half asleep, the words coming out of him before he was fully awake enough to stop them. He wrote it as a promise, to himself, to June, to the man he was trying to become and kept failing to be. Every verse was a contract. Every chorus was a signature. It was the most personal document he ever made public, dressed up in a melody so simple it sounded like something everyone already knew. That was the song Carson had just dared him to play, on a prop guitar, in front of 40 million people, on a night when Cash's voice was rough and his body was tired and the last thing he needed was a test. Carson had no idea what he had just asked for. 90 minutes before taping, Cash was in the green room and he already knew it was going to be a difficult night. His voice had been giving him trouble for 3 weeks, the kind of trouble that starts as roughness in the morning and by evening becomes something harder to hide. 6 cities in 11 days. Hotel rooms with thin walls and thinner air. The road had a way of taking things from a man quietly, piece by piece, until he stood in a mirror under fluorescent light and noticed the inventory was short. He stood in that green room and ran through the first verse of 3 different songs in his head, testing, measuring, the way a carpenter tests a floor before he puts his full weight on it. A production staffer knocked and came in without waiting for an answer. Young guy, clipboard, the slightly apologetic expression of someone delivering information they already knew wouldn't land well. He mentioned the guitar, told Cash it was a bit. Carson ran sometimes, loosened the room up, got a laugh. Nobody took it seriously. Other guests had picked it up, played 3 wrong notes, everybody laughed and moved on. It was television. It was nothing. Cash looked at him. "Is it in tune?" The staffer blinked. I'm not sure, Mr. Cash. I don't think that's really the—" "Find out," Cash said. The staffer left. Cash sat back down. He picked up his own guitar from the case beside the couch and held it across his knee without playing it. Just held it, the way a man holds something familiar when the unfamiliar is pressing in close. Out in the studio, Carson's monologue was landing perfectly. Every pause timed, every punchline clean, the audience exactly where he needed them. Warm, comfortable, trusting. The first guest had been smooth and packaged and television-ready in every way that Carson's machine ran best. Then Cash walked out. All black, road boots, the weight of a decade visible in the set of his shoulders. The audience applauded, but the energy in the room changed the way energy changes when something uncontrolled enters a controlled space. Carson felt it. He was too good at his job not to feel it. His eyes moved to the prop guitar in the corner of the set, and something in him made a decision that he would spend the next 40 minutes watching himself reconsider. He slid the guitar across the desk with a grin. The audience laughed. Cash looked at it sitting there between them under the studio lights, scratched body, dead finish, a crack running along the base of the neck. And he reached for it. He tuned it like nobody was watching. That was the first thing the room noticed, that Cash was not performing patience, not playing at being unbothered. He was simply, genuinely tuning a broken guitar on live television in front of 40 million people, and he did not appear to find anything unusual about that. His head bent slightly over the instrument. His fingers moved from peg to peg with the slow deliberateness of a man who had done this 10,000 times in 10,000 different rooms, and understood that no performance could begin before the instrument told the truth. One string was so far off it almost rang like a different note entirely. He adjusted it, plucked it, adjusted again. The studio audience, which had been laughing 30 seconds ago, went quiet by degrees, not silenced, just gradually, collectively, distracted from their own noise by something they couldn't quite name. Carson's grin held, but his eyes had changed. Cash looked up from the guitar, not at Carson, not at the camera. At a point somewhere above the audience in the middle distance, the way a man looks when he is not seeing the room in front of him but the room inside himself, the cotton fields, the reel-to-reel machine in Germany. The first time June heard the song and went still in the way she went still when something reached her past, the place where words worked. He had sung "I Walk the Line" hundreds of times, in concert halls and prison yards and radio studios and living rooms. He had sung it when he believed the promise it made, and sung it harder on the nights he wasn't sure he still could. Every single time the song required the same thing from him. Not a performance. A reckoning. He looked at Carson. One beat of eye contact. Then his hand settled on the neck of the cheap guitar, settled the way a hand settles on something trusted, and he began. The first note was wrong. Not badly wrong, not embarrassingly wrong, but wrong in the way that only a musician or a very quiet room could detect. The cheap guitar had a buzz in the low register that no studio instrument would have tolerated for 10 minutes. Cash didn't stop. He didn't flinch. He let the imperfect note exist and sang directly over it, and what happened in that collision between the flawed instrument and the voice that had been carrying this song for 20 years was something that could not have been manufactured in a recording studio with $1,000 of equipment. The flaw made the voice naked, and the naked voice made the song land like a fist against something soft. The woman in the third row stopped smiling first. Then the man beside her, who had been leaning toward his companion with a comment forming, closed his mouth and straightened slowly in his seat. In the back of the studio, an older man in a dark jacket closed his eyes, not from boredom, from the opposite of boredom, the thing that happens when music finds the exact location of something you stopped letting yourself feel. The bandleader, Doc Severinsen, had both hands in his lap. He was watching Cash the way musicians watch something they recognize as beyond technique. The camera held on Cash's face. Carson did not move. His hands were folded on the desk in front of him. The grin was gone, not replaced by anything dramatic, just gone. The way a man's face goes when the performance of ease is no longer possible because something real has entered the room and ease has no answer for it. Cash reached the chorus. His voice dropped lower instead of rising. On that cheap guitar, with that imperfect tuning, in that overlit studio, the man who wrote A Promise to Himself in the middle of the night in Germany in 1956 kept it one more time. The studio was completely, fully, entirely silent. If you've never seen someone stop a room like that, subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly these moments. Then one person in the back began to clap. Just one. Then another. Then Carson lifted both hands from the desk, slowly, not the practiced host applause of 17 years behind that desk, but something that came from a different place entirely, and the room broke open. Carson leaned toward the microphone. The applause was still moving through the studio, still finding its full shape when he said it. 4 words. Quiet enough that the audience almost missed them, loud enough that the camera picked them up clean. You win, John Cash. Not scripted, not timed, not the kind of thing a man who had hosted 17 years of live television said without knowing exactly what he was doing, except that in this moment, Carson didn't know exactly what he was doing, and that was the point. It was the most unguarded thing he had said on that stage in years, and every person in Studio One felt the difference between a line delivered and a truth admitted. The audience laughed, but it was different laughter than before. Warmer, softer at the edges. The laugh of people who had just watched something real happen and needed 30 seconds to come back to the world where things were rehearsed and cameras had schedules. Cash said nothing. He set the cheap guitar down across his knee and looked at Carson with an expression that was not victory and not satisfaction and not pride. It was the expression of a man who had simply done the thing that needed doing and was already moving past it in his mind. The commercial break hit. Carson came around the desk. He rarely did that during breaks. In 17 years, the crew had developed an understanding of the geography of Carson's set. His desk was his domain, the guest chair belonged to whoever was sitting in it, and the space between them was professional territory that Carson crossed deliberately and selectively. He crossed it now. He stood beside Cash and said something in a voice too low for any microphone to catch. Cash listened, nodded once, said something back. Carson looked at the cheap guitar still resting across Cash's knee and said something else. Cash picked it up and held it out. Carson took it, turned it over once in his hands the way a man handles an object that has just surprised him, and set it back down. Whatever passed between them in those 90 seconds stayed between them. But Doc Severinsen saw it from the bandstand. Later, he would say that in 23 years of watching Carson work, he had seen the man shaken exactly twice. This was one of them. Johnny didn't try to impress anybody, Severinsen said. That was the thing. He just played the song, and somehow that was the most impressive thing I ever saw on that stage. The prop guitar was returned to the corner of the set after taping wrapped. It was never used as a comedy bit again. Nobody issued a directive. Nobody made a decision in a meeting. It just quietly, permanently, stopped being a joke. June Carter Cash heard about the guitar before Johnny got home that night. A crew member called a friend who called someone else, the way news travels in television circles, sideways and fast. By the time Cash walked through the door, she already knew. Not the details, just the shape of what had happened. A dare, a broken instrument, a room that went silent. She didn't ask him to tell her about it. She had heard I Walk the Line the first time in 1956, standing in a hallway in Nashville with her arms crossed and her head tilted slightly, listening to a man she barely knew, yet sing a promise so direct and so undefended that she had to look away before he finished. She understood from that first hearing that the song was not a performance. It was a document. It was the most honest thing Johnny Cash knew how to say, dressed in a melody simple enough that the honesty couldn't hide behind the music. When she heard he had sung it on a broken guitar, dared into it on a bad night in front of 40 million people, she said 4 words to the person on the phone. Of course he did. That was all. She hung up and went back to whatever she had been doing. Because June Carter Cash had always understood something about her husband that the television industry spent years trying to learn and never quite managed. The man was not a performer who occasionally told the truth. He was a man who occasionally performed. The difference was everything. In the days that followed the broadcast, letters arrived at NBC. Not dozens, hundreds, then thousands. Vietnam veterans, factory workers, quiet men who had never written a letter to a television station in their lives and found themselves at a kitchen table at midnight not entirely sure why they were writing one now, but unable to stop. And somewhere in Burbank, Johnny Carson sat alone in his office and wrote something down that he never showed anyone. It was found in Carson's personal papers after he died in 2005. A single index card, handwritten in the small precise script he used for private notes, the ones he never intended anyone to read. No date, no recipient. Just a few lines written in the 90 seconds of a commercial break while the studio was resetting, and a man in all black was sitting across from him, holding a cheap guitar that had just done something no expensive instrument had managed in 17 years of late-night television. He had written, "He played a broken guitar, and it was the most honest thing I've ever seen on this stage. He never sent it, never mentioned it, never brought that night up in any interview in the years that followed. Carson was a man who guarded his interior life the way other men guard money. Carefully, completely, with the knowledge that once given away it could not be taken back. But he kept the card." Johnny Cash never described that night as a victory. When a journalist brought it up years later, Cash was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was a good guitar." That was all. The cheap guitar didn't make him sound worse. It made him sound truer. And truth, carried in the right hands, doesn't need a perfect instrument. It just needs a man willing to play it all the way through, on a bad night, in front of everyone, without apology. That was Johnny Cash. If stories like this are why you're here, subscribe. There are more, and they don't get told nearly enough.